Tonight we're going to see another of these Campbell videos on mythos. And it's the first of a block of 3. I frankly think it's the least interesting of the 3, and I was trying to find a way not to inflict it on you. But there are some important points that are made and that are building blocks, I think, to the context that he's building for the following 2. So it is an important video, but it also contains some errors. Recently, in recent years, the so-called Aryan invasion theory has been debunked by DNA studies and other studies. So his history of the ancient world is an inaccurate one. The Aryans didn't invade India. They moved out of that region and colonized Persia, Greece, and China, and Europe. So the Indo-Europeans were a name that wanted to give Europe some of the credit for what was really an Indian movement, although we really can't even use the word India. We would really need to use the word Bharat or Mahabharat to understand correctly the nature of the civilization that is not the same as the Indian civilization as we know it today, or for the last couple of thousand years, in fact. And the history that he tells, of course, leaves out the understanding of cyclical time. It leaves out the understanding of the destruction of the earlier, much higher civilizations that are known by such names as Atlantis and Lemuria and Hyperborea, and that whole history of the previous yuga, which of course is not recognized by the mainstream historians and archaeologists, but that there is plenty of evidence to support their reality. So take the historical lecture aspect of it with a grain of salt, but sea salt, and don't take it as a let's say a true model of the evolution of Indian spirituality. And he also misses the fact that the Persian religious or spiritual tradition that began, actually it didn't begin, but it became most known with the name of Zarathustra, Zoroaster, was a reaction to already a fall within the Vedic culture. And you remember in the Vedic culture, the good guys were the Devas and Devis, and the bad guys were the Asuras. And Zoroaster flipped it around and made the Asuras the good guys, although the name changed to Ahura rather than Asura, and the god of light was Ahura Mazda, right? So the relationship and the antagonism and the evolution of the Indian civilization to the Persian and their relationship is not accurately depicted. There are a number of other points. I can't remember all of the points that I disagreed with when I saw the film, but there were a number of them, and a number of, let's say, inaccurate contextualizations, including the relationship, let's say, to yoga and Indian philosophy and that of Greek philosophy. It's a very close relationship. And there are points in Plato's dialogues that are direct quotes from the Upanishads, and there was a great deal of commerce between the Indian spiritual teachers and the Greeks. And people like Heraclitus came from the Persian area. containing a lot of the same yogic information, inflected slightly with that Persian twist, but very much there was a uniformity of the basic understanding of reality, but it was already bifurcating into the question of is there one force that evolves or devolves from a yuga of light, a Sat Yuga, to a Kali Yuga of dark, or are there two forces that are antagonistic to one another? And this question of duality versus monism or monotheism becomes ever more, let's say, crucial to the development of the religions, especially that are postulated in the West, which do postulate one God, but on the other hand, there is a devil, there is Satan, there is this let's say, evil impulse of the ego. So whether you want to conceptualize it in a dualistic form or a monistic form is not so important, because psychologically the same kind of dynamics have to be confronted. However, if you have a model that is completely a unified field, then it's much easier to integrate these aspects of consciousness that, as we get deeper into Kali Yuga, are going to fragment more and more into a whole spectrum of light and dark, healthy and unhealthy, good and evil aspects of the soul of everyone. And what's particularly relevant now, I think, is that as we get to the very end of Kali Yuga, the dark force of the ego is in hegemonic control of the world, at least apparently. And of course, the final revelation will be the snapback of the divine light and love, and the re-emergence of that supreme power of love that will then restore the world to its original beauty and goodness and purity, etc. So the story is not told in the most accurate way, but there are important understandings in terms of the development or of the differentiation from the Vedic period, in which sacrifice of a very concrete kind of sacrifice of animals, and in some cases human sacrifice, and which is distributed through many of the cultures of that period, including in Mexico and South America, in those cultures. But also and in the Hebrew temple, sacrifice of the burnt offerings of the bulls, etc. So you had a very bloody kind of religious experience in which one had to confront the reality of death in a very powerful, shocking way that produced a rite of passage to a level of, let's say, dispassion or vairagya, and a very real willingness to face reality without the fear of death. And this was essential to those cultures in producing a warrior class, the kshatriyas, who were willing to not only defend the culture, but to expand the boundaries when necessary, or later on when, at the whim of people like Alexander the Great, who simply wanted to conquer the whole world, etc. Of course, not able to do that. But these encounters with the limits of the potentialities of a military culture, were also the testing ground of manhood in those periods. And then they also led later on to the development of various different forms of political organization. So the point, however, that is to me most important in the film is the understanding that develops of the emergence of the Jains and the Buddhists and the sannyasis, those who recognized that not only must one face death, but that the world of life is a veil of illusion, not over death, but over that which is beyond both life and death. And the piercing of that veil was of urgent significance for the people of that period. And their religion, their vows, their practices were of an extreme asceticism, especially the Jains, who very literally worked hard to extinguish any last trace of the ego's desire to live in a physical body. And of course, this was also the original, very close to the original Buddhist, the Theravada Buddhism. But then, the Mahayana came in, and that version was much more appropriate to a layman's version of nirvana, let's say, of the understanding of nirvana as encompassing and including samsara. But it's misunderstood by many people who study Buddhism in thinking that you can be in samsara and nirvana and still actually identify with your ego. No, if you're going to have that integration, you have to have pierced the veil of illusion and killed the ego. But then what remains and what is able to be embodied is the purity of the infinite intelligence of that supreme reality, no longer obstructed by egoic illusion. And that is the goal that is now ever more urgently needed to be achieved as we approach the end. I would even say that the Jain model is becoming ever more relevant because our freedom to move, our freedom to act, to be free of the various constraints, including illness, but all of the various constraints on life that are increasing, make it very appropriate to adopt that impulse of the upper death drive to be done with all appetite, all attachment, all interest in the phenomenal plane. And we are now approaching that moment where the steepness of the drop into the final collapse of Kali Yuga is going to be accentuated by more and more massively catastrophic events. We just recently saw 2 cases of the dodging of a bullet by Hawaii with a hurricane there, and now South Florida, another. But I think soon the dodging of bullets will end, and the bullets are going to be hitting very, very hard. But I think this is part of keeping people asleep and feeling complacent and smug as we approach that. And yogis should not fall into that self-deceptive belief that, oh, everything is normal, and there aren't any major angels of death approaching, but there are. And I think as we approach the real core of the let's say, the tenor of the end times, as the darkness and the horror become more extreme and more widespread, what we are going to see is the equivalent of what is happening now in most of the Western economies, which is the destruction of the middle class. And there will only remain the very rich elite, and almost everyone else will be impoverished and homeless and without any support or any voice, and will be simply cannon fodder or nuclear fodder for the coming events. But in the same way, on a spiritual level, what is happening is that those who are in the middle chakras and the middle assemblage points are going to find that those levels are not sufficient to hold together a consciousness in a state of integrity. And those in the lower chakras in particular are going to find that the most primitive aspects of ego consciousness are going to emerge, which means that people will feel more hatred, more envy, more terror, more of the most primitive emotions are going to come out, and with a lack of control over them, and more of an overwhelming feeling of being possessed by these dark energies, both from within and attracted from without. And so it's of very great importance then to get beyond that level, to get to that level that Campbell was describing in the last video we saw, of going through chakra 7 and only your footprints remain, only the ability to speak from beyond the veil, but with no identification any longer with the physical body. And only, I think, in that level of consciousness will peace be able to be sustained, but also offered to those who are struggling and coming apart. So as we approach this, we're going to see this phenomenon happening more and more, and we're going to see let's say, the reaping of negative karma in everyone who still has traces of a karmic attachment to the body and to the mind of the ego. So that there will be more and more mental breakdowns and meltdowns, and more physical phenomenal things happening that one will not be happy about. So we have to be able to take these things in our stride, because they're going to happen to everyone to some extent, and we're going to have to learn from them and use them as increasing our incentive to be free of attachment to anything in the phenomenal plane, and to accept that karma without getting angry and without losing our composure even more because of what's happening. So the bottom line recommendation is to be as completely dedicated to reaching total inner silence and unity with the supreme light and love of the one self, and no longer identified as a separate being, but able to let the body function in its most healthy way by not having any karmic implicate energies that would express themselves as symptoms of suffering any longer in the body. But all of that, the purification of the soul and the healing of whatever had been projected in the body, can only happen from chakra 7. So that's the message that must be delivered, and I hope will be internalized and mobilized for the sake of each one and for the sake of all. But we have to leave the ego behind, including all of the ego's attachment to things, to properties, to money, to other people, and to be able to relate only to God. Which brings me back to the subject of the Rabbi Heschel that we saw the other night. And you remember he said an interesting thing. He said, first, God, he was very happy that God had created many religions, that you can get to God through any of these. But then he also said he would die for his religion. Now, there's nowhere in Judaism where it says you should die for the religion. It says you should live and love only God. And if you're going to die for anything, it's for God, but not for a religion. This is the mistake of all Kali Yuga religion. It's an identity with the symbolic representation of God and all of the texts, the scriptures. Literally, Judaism is the worship of the Torah and of the Talmud and of the scriptures. And so are all the religions. The Muslims with the Quran and the Gospels for the Christians, etc. And we have to get beyond our attachment to scriptures. Not that anyone here necessarily has that problem, but many do have an attachment to a tradition or an identification as a person who belongs to a certain tribe or a certain clan or a certain lineage or even a certain nationality or whatever cultural signifiers one is identified with. And that must be let go of so that the mind is absolutely emptied and purified to receive the supreme light without any kind of inflection of a symbolic ramification that would then bring back all of those relationships to the body that the mind produces very easily as soon as you represent yourself as a person who is loyal to God in a dualistic way, or disloyal, either way. But that identity as a being separate from God must be eliminated. Not that one should have the idea that one is not separate from God either. What has to be let go of is the entire symbolic dimension, which has no validity. We must go to the real. The symbolic is that last level of the illusion that people cling to. That's why Campbell didn't receive liberation. People asked about that last time. Not only is he wrong about a lot of things and didn't connect many of the dots, but the clinging to the symbolic identity as one who knows, as a professor, as a rabbi, as a priest, as a mullah, whatever. Whatever identifications one has and uses as one's calling card, these must be let go of. So the kind of and the level of purification that is necessary to achieve Jivan Mukti is extremely pure and deep. And if we're going to be able to bask in the light of God's presence as without any differential, there has to be a letting go of all of the heritage of the symbolic legacy of humanity throughout its Kali Yuga history in order to be able to reach the real. And this, I think, is more of a sacrifice than even the more physical ascetic practices that may be forced upon us by circumstances, even if not by desire. So the symbolic liberation or liberation from language, from signifiers, from narratives, from beliefs, all of it one must be free of, including any beliefs in some Sat Yoga narrative. That Sat Yoga teachings must be used as an acid to wipe away all of the other false beliefs, but then that must be thrown in the fire as well, along with whatever last trace of the ego that was holding on to those beliefs. But so long as there is a belief that one is a person who has desires, who has fears, who has intentions, and isn't surrendered to the intentions of God to move the body through time and space without one's own getting in the way and making demands or wanting things one's own way or wanting to do what the jouissance, let's say, of the desire to break the rules, of the desire to act out, even subconsciously, one's envy, one's hatred, one's sense of inferiority. Every ego has, at its most base level, a kind of desire for revenge for all of the traumas that it suffered in childhood. And until that is purified, until that desire for revenge and the desire to be loved and to get what one didn't get in the past has been let go, there will always be a weakness within the consciousness that can lead to a mental or emotional breakdown that can be extremely severe in these conditions in which the supports and props of the ego identity are falling away at the same time. So that's all I have to say about that. I don't want to belabor the point, but I do recommend a redoubling of your efforts to transcend the ego with divine love.